Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Coming up on today's programme, Israel carries out an airstrike and drone attacks on the Syrian Defence Ministry headquarters. This follows clashes between Syrian government forces and Druze armed groups in the Syrian province of Sweida. We'll be asking, why is Israel getting involved in this? And 20 people are killed in a stampede at an aid distribution site in southern Gaza. We'll get the latest on the humanitarian situation there. Plus, President Trump's 50-day countdown has begun for President Putin to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine. But as Russia strikes 4 Ukrainian cities overnight, there's no indication that Moscow is changing tack. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin in Syria, where tensions are escalating. Israeli forces have carried out a second strike on Syrian Army headquarters in Damascus within the space of a few hours. Well, the latest strike was reportedly more intense and more destructive than the first. Well, Israel's also launched additional attacks on the southern city of Sweida, which is a predominantly Druze area of the country. Well, before we bring in our guests, let's take a quick look at what's going on. Well, in Sweida, fighting has broken out between Druze armed groups and Syrian government forces after a ceasefire fell apart. That's where Israel has stepped in. Well, Israel says it's intervening to protect the Druze community and has warned Damascus to withdraw its troops from Sweida or face further strikes. And for further context, the Syrian Druze community also lives in the Golan Heights, which is a strategic area that Israel captured from Syria in 1967 and still controls today. Well, we're going to head now to Tel Aviv. We can speak to Eylon Levy, who is a former international spokesperson for the Israeli government. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Good evening.
What is your understanding of what Israel is seeking to achieve in southern Syria?
Israel is staging a humanitarian intervention here to protect the Druze minority in Syria. Israelis have been horrified in recent days to see images of Druze people being attacked by regime forces in Syria, including reports, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, of 21 extrajudicial executions. Now, Israel is a Jewish state, but it has a big Druze minority. They're a well-integrated part of society, and they're begging the government to do something to save their brothers across the border. In fact, we've seen hundreds of Druze men breaking into Syria to go and fight on behalf of their Druze brethren. So Israel here is trying to tell Jolani, back off, the Druze must be protected, and they're under our protection. We won't allow you to attack them.
The Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, calling on Damascus, quote, leave the Druze in Sweida alone. He's then been firing drones, and there's been an airstrike on the military headquarters in Damascus. And I'm just wondering where you think this is helpful in achieving that goal.
Well, Israel's trying to get the Jolani's forces to back off from attacking the Druze in southern Syria. Let's remember, Jolani was until recently an al-Qaeda terrorist, until he trimmed his beard and put on a new suit. And Israel is very skeptical and wary. It's called him a wolf in sheep's clothing, hoping that he will want to be part of the circle of peace and normalization in the Middle East, but worrying that the leopard hasn't changed its spots. So I think by attacking the military headquarters in Damascus, Israel is sending a message to the Syrian military that it should pull back from Sweida and stop attacking the Druze over there, and not just by attacking the forces once they're actually in Sweida, but also sending a clear message to the military leadership that the Druze must be protected. And I think it's a positive development that in just the last few hours, we've seen a statement coming from the Syrian government, I think trying to calm things down and committing to the protection of Druze civilians, saying that that incident must be investigated, hoping, I hope, of course, that the civilians there will remain protected.
Yeah, I mean, you haven't mentioned one other part of the story, which is that the Syrian army went to Sweida to try to put down clashes that have broken out between the Druze and Bedouin armed groups. I mean, that's the backstory, isn't it? That's what sparked this. I mean, the Syrian armed forces didn't go to Sweida to attack Druze people, did they?
No. Well, I think there are two aspects here. The first is that the Druze people in Syria came under attack from Bedouin forces loyal to the regime. We've seen really horrific reports of human rights abuses taking place there. One senior Druze official in Israel saying this is, the Druze of Syria's 7th of October. But there is another region, which is that Israel wants southern Syria to be demilitarized. The lesson that Israel drew from October 7th is that it cannot allow hostile forces to amass on its border and hope that it can deter them or have advanced warning of an attack. So there are two interests. One, a humanitarian interest to protect the Druze of southern Syria, and the second, a desire to keep Jolani's forces away from the Israeli border in order to promote regional stability and make sure that we don't get those hostile forces amassing on Israel's border. Those two interests go hand in hand.
I mean, some might say, what business has Israel got dictating terms to a sovereign state on where it can and cannot have its soldiers in that country, especially when they say they're going there to put down clashes that have broken out. These are historic clashes. These are nothing new. The clashes between Bedouin armed groups and the Druze, they go back a long way, I'm told. I mean, what do you say to that?
Well, the public pressure in Israel for a humanitarian intervention is coming from the Druze community inside Israel. It's not coming from radical settlers or the far right. It's coming from the Druze minority in Israel, many of whom have family in southern Syria. And they've been watching the images on social media of the atrocities, and they're demanding action. They've declared a general strike. They've been protesting on the border. They've been blocking highways. We've had hundreds of Israeli Druze men breaking into Syria to go and fight, and the community leadership telling men to get ready and go and fight in Syria to protect their own brethren if that's needed. And the Druze are a very loyal minority inside Israel. They're punching way above their weight in the army, in the police force, in the civil service as well. And they're telling the Israeli government, we have stood by your side to help protect our country. Now we need you to come to the defense of our cousins across the border who are being slaughtered. And I think there are two aspects here. One, Israel as a Jewish state says we cannot allow a minority to be targeted just over the border and stand idly by. It goes against the soul of who we are. We know as Jews what it's like to be persecuted. But also, owing that debt of loyalty to the Druze community inside Israel, it can't stand idly by while their cousins are being slaughtered just across the border.
I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm recalling events only a week or so ago when Christians in the West Bank, who say they were coming under renewed and sustained attack from Israeli settlers, were calling for action. We had the patriarch, I think it was, of the Greek Orthodox Church there, saying that several sacred sites in the West Bank, Christian sacred sites, had been desecrated, vandalized. I mean, if Israel's goal is to defend religious minorities in the region, I mean, some might say perhaps it might look a little closer to home.
Yeah, well, I've seen those ghastly reports, and I certainly hope that they are investigated in full and that the perpetrators are held accountable. As far as I'm concerned, there's absolutely no excuse for that sort of vigilante violence. But that doesn't change the fact that there is a big domestic constituency inside Israel, within Druze society, that is demanding humanitarian protections for the Druze of Syria. And Israel looks at them and expects they need to be protected. And if Israel doesn't protect them, no one else is going to. And as I said, there's a confluence of interests. Israel wants to keep Syrian regime forces away from the border because it doesn't trust an army that is now run by an ex-Al-Qaeda militant. But also the government is under significant domestic pressure to protect the Druze. And if the Israeli government were to decide to say, not our business, Jolani can do whatever he wants to the Druze of Syria, they would have a serious domestic problem from a large, very loyal minority group that is expecting the government to do something to protect their families across the border.
You mentioned the Syrian leadership on more than one occasion already, Mr. Levy, and President Ahmed al-Shara was the man who was embraced, let's not forget, only 2 months ago, quite literally, by President Donald Trump. I mean, are you suggesting he is not the right man for the job?
Well, President al-Shara was until recently on America's most wanted list. America had a $5 million bounty, I think, on his head. He was only taken off the most wanted list once he started giving press conferences from the presidential palace in Damascus. He's a former Al-Qaeda militant who now wears a suit and has trimmed his beard. Now, Israel hopes, of course, the leopard has changed its spots, that his focus now is to build Syria, to stabilize that country, and that he's not an Islamist who's looking for wars. But Israel is, of course, skeptical, and experience has shown that people like that should be treated with skepticism. Israel would like to have peace with Syria. We're seeing positive developments. The fall of the Assad regime has knocked Syria out of the Iranian axis. It stopped weapons smuggling to Hezbollah. We've had meetings between Jolani and senior Israeli officials. These are positive developments. But at the same time, Israel, I think, is right to suspect that he hasn't become, a Western liberal overnight, and that there are still serious Islamist inclinations in his government. And if we're going to have normalization, then the Syrian government is going to have to prove its peaceful intentions. And one way to prove its peaceful intentions is to make sure that all non-Muslim minorities in Syria are protected as well.
Mr. Levy, you've mentioned normalization, and I wanted to ask you about that in any case, because Israel expressed a desire to normalize ties with other countries in the region, and Syria was one of them. Lebanon could be another. And I'm just struggling to reconcile that kind of ambition and that kind of narrative with the airstrikes carried out on the heart of Damascus today. How do you reconcile that?
Israel wants the October 7th war to end with peace. And we're on the cusp of a historic breakthrough, normalization with Lebanon, with Syria, with Saudi Arabia that want to turn a new leaf, and that would be a fantastic development. But peace is what happens when war ends, and Syria is still in a state of war with Israel because the Assad regime never recognized Israel. Now, there is a question about whether the attacks on the Druze civilians in Sweida in fact pushes peace further away, because I think there are two options. Either Jolani is behind the persecution of Druze civilians in Sweida, in which case many people in Israel, including Israeli Druze, will say, how can we make peace with a man who is persecuting our brethren across the border? Or they're being attacked by rogue forces, and then there's the question, how can you have a border security arrangement with a country that can't even control its own forces? Maybe Jolani isn't as secure in power in Syria as he would hope. But in any case, we're hearing the American administration trying to calm down the temperatures and get normalization back on track. And I hope we will be able to have peace and normalization with Syria, and that it will be a peace that's based on the protection of minority rights in Syria as well.
I just want to pick up on that point just one more time about the president of Syria. And I'm hearing from you a sense that you think the United States has been either naive or hasty or both to welcome President Bashar in from the cold, essentially. I mean, is that what you think?
I think the United States has a clear interest to try to draw Syria into the Western orbit, because the alternative, having just kicked out the Russians, is that Syria ends up in China's orbit. There is, of course, a scramble now for influence inside Syria. The Turks, the Qataris are also trying to gain influence, and it's important for the United States to draw them into the Western orbit and help to make peace. But one does have to wonder whether the decision to lift sanctions on Syria was a little bit too hasty, because the United States was not demanding that the new regime prove anything or meet any specific goals and targets. It was unconditional. And I hope that Jolani, who used to be an HTS al-Qaeda militant, really has changed his stripes and is committed to moderation. And this isn't a big deception ruse to try to trick the West. But I think Israel is going to treat him with caution, fear the worst, and hope for the best.
And when it comes to the Druze, I mean, they don't all speak with one voice, do they? So when Israel says it wants to protect this minority, which they are, there's only 1.2 million Druze in the entire Middle East region. That's according to estimates. Is there a risk that perhaps Israel is doing many of the Druze a disservice by framing them as being a protected people by Israel, which may cause them other problems in a region where, a lot of countries have not normalized ties with Israel?
You're right, the Druze don't speak in one voice. They're a minority group that has always been loyal to the countries they live in, and now they find themselves under attack in Syria. But as I said, the demand to protect the Druze is coming from Druze inside Israel. And I'm sure that if they thought that demanding intervention to protect their cousins in Sweida were going to put them in further trouble, they wouldn't do that. Instead, they're demanding that Israel help them, that they protect them, because they think that that's what's best for their cousins over the border. And I'm sure they have a better idea of what's good for the Druze in Syria better than either you or I have.
I mean, there are people who, even at the outset of the beginning of the end of Bashar al-Assad's rule in Syria, who saw, incursions by Israeli forces into Syrian territory, and they saw this as opportunism. And there may be people who are out there saying they're getting involved in the plight of the Druze in southern Syria, close to Israel's border and close to the Golan Heights, is again an attempt to divide and conquer and foment unrest. What do you say to that?
Israel doesn't want to divide and conquer, but it does want to keep hostile forces away from its border. The lesson that Israel learned from the October 7th massacre is that we're just too small and just too vulnerable to allow enemy forces to sit on the border and then hope that we'll receive an advance warning before they attack. It failed in Gaza, where we were invaded by thousands of Hamas terrorists on October 7th. They brutally murdered 1,200 people. It allowed Hezbollah to build an arsenal of over 100,000 missiles. And Israel is now using its moment of strength, having largely won the October 7th war, to promote regional stability by pushing threats away from the border. It's saying we can't let those threats build up on our border and then hope we can deter them. In order to keep ourselves safe and then to prevent the risk of conflict, we need to push hostile forces away from the border. So there's definitely a question whether supporting the Druze in Syria is a question of overreach, overextension, whether Israel is biting off more than it can chew. But Israel's strategic understanding has definitely shifted. We can't allow jihadi forces to sit along the border to create a jihadi safe haven and just hope that things will be okay. Israel now says we learned the hard way what happens when hostile forces build up on our border, and we can't let them get anywhere close to Israeli civilians again.
I mean, just the geography has to be, we have to remind our viewers that Sweida is not really very far from Damascus. So the idea of there being no Syrian forces close to the capital is a bit unrealistic, isn't it? It's only about 40 kilometers away from the Syrian capital, Damascus.
Exactly. Sweida is not very far from Damascus, and Damascus isn't very far from Israel. Israel's a very small country, and these forces are in very close proximity. And Israel has no strategic depth. What it is doing now, by helping to protect the Druze civilians who want that support inside Syria, is to make sure that hostile forces can't approach the border. And so, as I said, these two interests go hand in hand. On the one hand, Israel's strategic understanding of how to promote regional stability and to forestall conflict by keeping threats away from the border, and a genuine humanitarian impulse under domestic pressure from Druze in Israel to protect Druze civilians. I think Israel would rather see southern Syria be some sort of Druze autonomous region or an area where the Druze are able to protect themselves than to have the forces under control of an ex-Al-Qaeda commander in charge of this vulnerable religious minority.
And yet these hostile forces that you're talking about are the forces of a government with which Israel does not exclude and possibly even welcomes the idea of a normalization of ties. It's very difficult to join all the dots there.
Not at all. I mean, these are hostile forces because they're forces of a government that remains at a state of war with Israel. If that government makes peace with Israel, then they won't be hostile forces. They'll be friendly. But that's why we need a diplomatic process to promote normalization between Israel and Syria. And I hope that all international diplomats and world leaders say it's a once-in-a-lifetime historic opportunity now to promote peace and normalization in the Middle East, because everything has changed in the wake of the October 7th war.
Sure, I mean, a lot has changed, that's absolutely unquestionable. And one of the significant issues with regards to this particular matter is the fact that the Syrian government is very much in the fold now, it would appear, of the Trump administration, of other regional allies. Israel is, of course, an ally as well. What's Washington, just to wrap up, what does Washington make of Israel's incursions into Syria and these latest developments? So have we heard anything yet?
The latest report that I've seen from Axios is that Washington is trying to cool the temperatures. It wants a de-escalation. Of course, as part of that, it will want the Syrian government to commit to protections of the Druze minority and all other minorities inside Syria. But I think President Trump has an agenda now. He wants to get peace and normalization in the Middle East. He wants that to be his legacy. And so they're going to want to try to de-escalate in order to promote those peace agreements. But as I said, given the domestic pressure from the Druze inside Israel, peace with Syria is only going to be possible if the Druze are protected. Israel won't be able to normalize relations with Syria if it's persecuting the Druze in Sweida at the same time.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. A pleasure talking to you, Eylon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, for more analysis on this, I'm joined now by Dr. Sami Nader, who is director at the Levant Institute for Strategic Affairs, LISA. He joins us from Beirut. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Dr. Nader.
My pleasure, thank you.
I mean, this is a really complicated story for a lot of people to understand. And I just want to do a little recap with you here, because we've got a situation where fighting between Druze fighters and Bedouin armed men triggered the Syrian government to send in forces to get involved. And now the Israelis are getting involved to protect the Druze from the Syrian armed forces. Is that roughly your understanding of this whole situation?
Yes, definitely. This is the situation. And it shows that we have conflicting agendas when it comes to redrawing the map of the Middle East. Because what we are in front of today, it's not just an ethnic conflict. It's the withdrawing of the Levant map after the earthquake, the geopolitical earthquake that happens with the fall of the Assad regime in Syria and decrease or the collapse of Iranian influence in the region. So we have at least two agendas when it comes to redrawing the map of the Levant. One is based on the status quo ante that prevailed, meaning the states as it was drawn more or less in the wake of the First World War, meaning Iraq, Syria, Lebanon as we know them. And another one, another vision driven by the Israeli government, and the Israeli were open about it lately when they are talking about the partition of Syria based on ethnicity, meaning that the Kurds will carve up their own autonomy, their own small state, the Druze as well at the Alawite. But this would mean to reconsider the whole map of the Levant, particularly Lebanon, Iraq, and it will not stop at the border of Syria. And this is a huge bet, and I don't think it will get the support of any regional power or international power. And the first party that is opposing it's the United States of America. But definitely what's happening in Sweida today, it's beyond a small ethnic conflict between Bedouin, Arab, and Druze.
Okay, I mean, you're framing the situation in a different way from our previous guest. We spoke to a former spokesperson for the Israeli government who said, really, this is simply a case of Israel wanting to defend an ethnic and religious minority in another country. I mean, do you buy that?
I mean, yeah, this is an excuse. This is part of, or the justification of a broader map that, in my view, from an Israeli standpoint, can ensure the stability of and the security of Israel in the long run, which is bordering itself by a small state that will rely on it for their own security and not never being able of threatening its own security. Now the intervention, the military intervention, because it does not find any international support from regional power and not under international law. This is one important aspect. So they cannot be officially vocal about it, though we have heard some voices lately close to the decision maker in Israel pushing this new agenda of the Middle East. And it's Mr. Netanyahu himself saying about a new Middle East that needs to emerge after the strike in Iran and after the collapse of the Assad regime.
Okay, you mentioned President Assad there. I just wanted to ask you whether these types of clashes between Bedouin tribes and the Druze also happened under President Assad, and if so, what was different? What did he do to put down clashes of these kind?
Mr. Assad himself was trying to push for what we call the alliance of minorities in order to contain the majority of Sunnis that were challenging his power and that were claiming their part of freedom. They were asking for their share or the minimum their minimum right for participation. And Mr. Assad tried to get the support of the minority, what we call the minorities in Syria, namely the Druze, the Christians, and the Alawite, being himself Alawite, in order to face this Sunni opposition, bearing in mind that he did not guarantee any right for these minorities. He wanted to subdue them, to having them on his side, in order to present himself as a protector of these minorities, as a protector of as a promoter of a secular state, trying to depict his opponents as Islamist group. And this was his strategy since day one. Today, the situation is different. This does not disenfranchise the current government of Mr. Shara of all responsibility. Mr. Shara needs to prove that he's capable of putting in place, a government that is an inclusive government that can protect the right of not of the different religious group in Syria, but all the Syrian citizens, whatever their ethnic group is.
I mean, we've heard from Israel this desire to protect the Druze because they feel some solidarity with them being in a minority. I'm just wondering how the Druze feel about that, because there's a chance, isn't there, and a risk that they'll be doing a disservice to the Druze by having them framed as being a people under Israel's protection. I mean, is that risky for the Druze to have that sort of association?
This is a very important question indeed. The Druze are in a very tough situation. On one hand, they suffered from the past regime because they did not get this right, and they suffer from, like any other community, from the wrongdoing and misconduct of an authoritarian regime. Today, they are worried about their future because they are still waiting an inclusive government that will be respectful of their own right. This is on one hand. On the other hand, some extremist movement emerged lately, and this is feeding their fear and their concern. But those Druze, since day one, the creation of Syria, their identity is 100% an Arab identity, and they have been standard bearer. They champion Syria independence. They face up to the French mandate for the colonial type of regime that the French were trying to put in place in the early of the last century. And they have been totally champion of the Arab cause. This is why their identity is deeply an Arab identity, and they are taking their distance from any alliance with Israel. That said, there is a community of Druze living inside Israel, and since 1948, and they are Israeli citizens. And there is this, they have this belonging to Israel, but as citizen and not as Druze. But this is what it comes to the Druze of Israel. While the Druze of Syria, they are Arab Druze. It's true that some of them are betting on on reforming the Syrian state, while the others are more skeptical, and they are asking today for a decentralized form of government, like the Sheikh Hishri, for instance. He's trying to push a reform agenda based on decentralization, which will guarantee the autonomy of the Druze region, like Sweida.
Lebanon, where you are now, is home to the world's second largest Druze community after Syria. And then I believe it's Israel and Jordan in that order. Lebanon, of course, home to a famous leader in the Druze community and a political leader in the form of Walid Jumblat. What are we hearing from community leaders like Jumblat with regards to this particular issue?
Jumblat is very clear. He is those who are betting on the Arab identity of the Druze community, on the Druze alliance or the Druze natural belonging to what we call the Arab family. They have developed strong relationship with Arab countries, and namely Saudi Arabia. Today, Walid Jumblat is saying that the Druze in Syria need the protection of the Syrian state, and it's up to the Syrian state to secure the lives of the Druze. So he totally rejects any kind of alliance with Israel in order to protect the Druze minority. So he's betting on Mr. Shara government, he's betting on Syria and the Druze belonging to the Arab family as the right way to secure their perennity and their security.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you very much indeed. Really helpful to get your analysis. Dr. Sami Nader, thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.
A pleasure.
Now let's turn to the latest developments in Ukraine. And the US President Donald Trump has been taking swift action just one day after speaking from the Oval Office alongside the NATO Secretary General to announce what was described as a really big arms package. He now says that the weapons he vowed to send Ukraine have already been delivered. Well, these include Patriot missile defense systems. And despite sending these weapons, President Trump has made it clear that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky should not try striking deep into Russia. Let's take a listen.
Should Zelensky target Moscow? Should Zelensky target Moscow, sir? Should Zelensky target Moscow or deeper into Russia?
No, he shouldn't target Moscow.
Is that why you gave him more weapons, though?
President Trump speaking there. Well, for more, we can speak now to Sir Mark Lyle-Grant, who is the former UK National Security Advisor and former permanent representative of the UK to the United Nations. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Sir Mark. We just heard there President Trump saying Ukraine should not target Moscow. I mean, what's your reading of this?
Well, it is slightly confusing. I think it's perhaps a misunderstanding of what he originally said about asking Zelensky whether he was capable of targeting Moscow. And Zelensky said yes. And I think that was interpreted in some of the press as encouraging President Zelensky to target Moscow. And I think what President Trump was trying to do is row back on that, not only because that would obviously, the Russians were alarmed by that suggestion in the press. And secondly, he doesn't want to see a lot more civilian sort of casualties in Moscow. So I think he's just rowing back on some of the reported statements he's made before. But as we know, President Trump makes a lot of confusing statements, so interpreting them is not always easy.
One of the things he said that's quite clear is that he wants a ceasefire within 50 days or else serious sanctions are going to kick in. What do you think of that? What do you think the rationale is for waiting 50 days?
Well, I think he's just giving President Putin yet another chance to show that he's prepared to come to the table. The reality is that President Putin has played President Trump quite well over the last 6 months. And I think he's getting increasingly frustrated by evidence of that. And he's being pushed not only by some in his own party, the Republican Party in Congress, like Lindsey Graham, but apparently also by his wife, Melania, into recognizing that Putin actually isn't interested in any sort of peace deal. And that's why he's now set a deadline. I mean, I think that deadline, to be honest, is probably more welcomed in Moscow than it is in Kyiv, because it gives President Putin another 50 days in order to continue his campaign against Ukraine and also to think of some other excuse to sort of push the can down the road.
Yeah, yesterday we spoke to officials in Kyiv and in Moscow. And there was dismay in Kyiv about those 50 days, where they view those 50 days as being a gift, as you're suggesting, to Russia. And in Moscow, we heard them saying that Russia will simply ignore this deadline. Does that sound likely to you?
Well, I'm less sure about that. I mean, there's no doubt that President Trump is getting more frustrated. He has promised this deal with the Secretary General of NATO, whereby the Europeans can provide more high-end, sophisticated, particularly defensive armaments, such as the Patriot missile system, which will then be replaced by the Europeans buying that kit from the United States. So that is an encouraging sign that President Trump wants to empower Ukraine to continue the fight. And I think the threat of sanctions, if another 50 days passes and nothing happens, I think he will come under huge pressure, both in the United States and from European allies, to actually go forward on his promise and impose strong tariffs, and particularly secondary sanctions, if you like, secondary tariffs on Russia.
Okay, I mean, clearly President Trump under pressure from all sides, and all the while, of course, lives being lost on the battlefield. I just want to ask you a bit more about his approach to arming Ukraine, which, as we've been saying, is to ask European allies to donate their weapons and then basically sell them American replacements. I mean, do you think this is a fair system?
Well, it's less favorable to the Europeans than, of course, the Americans themselves paying and supplying the weaponry. But it is at least an opportunity to give to Ukraine some of the more sophisticated high-end weaponry they need to defend themselves, particularly against what we're seeing is an intensification of Russian bombardment by missiles and drones over the last couple of months. So it is a good response, but of course it is the Europeans who are going to pay for that, which is what President Trump wants.
Yeah, and in terms of the distribution, I mean, I don't think this is very well tried and tested territory, but there is this mechanism known as the NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine mechanism based out of Germany. I mean, do you think that's going to be the sort of the umbrella that ensures that the right allies donate the right weapons and sort of coordinate the whole thing?
Well, there's a number of different bodies. I mean, there's NATO itself, there's a sort of coalition of the willing. There's a number of smaller groups, which involves the United Kingdom, France, and Germany in particular. So I don't know exactly who is going to be coordinating this weaponry, but I think the Secretary General of NATO will be heavily involved, and it will be responding to requirements set out by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and President Zelensky. So I'm encouraged by this latest move. It will enable Ukraine to resist for longer than perhaps otherwise might have been the case, as the Russians make sort of incremental advances on the ground. And at the end of 50 days, I certainly hope that President Trump, if there is no breakthrough in terms of a deal, will follow through on his threat to impose tariffs, really crippling tariffs, on the Russian oil and gas sector.
I mean, is there a shortage of Patriots in the world? And if there is, these missile defense systems I'm talking about, if there is a shortage of them, isn't it quite risky for European allies to donate their supplies when in fact they might not have enough of their own?
Well, there is a shortage, undoubtedly, and they're expensive and it takes time to produce. But I think the Europeans can afford to give away some of their stocks, provided that they know that they're going to be able to buy them back in time from the Americans, because I don't think European countries feel that they are under imminent threat from a missile attack or a drone attack from outside in the way that Ukraine obviously is on a daily basis.
There seems to be a bit of unease in Europe about this mechanism of getting European allies to pay for weaponry. We heard the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Kaja Kallas, saying, if we pay for these weapons, it's our support, it's European support. If you promise to give the weapons, but you say that someone else is going to pay for it, then it's not really you giving it, is it? She said. Are you sensing a little bit of friction, a bit of irritation coming from Brussels, though?
Well, I think there is some irritation, undoubtedly, under the surface in Brussels, because President Trump has made clear all along, including at the recent NATO summit, that he expects the Europeans to step up and do the heavy lifting in terms of military support for Ukraine. And the Europeans have indeed responded. But I think the Europeans are still hoping that America will put its own money, financial and military support to Ukraine into the mix. And I think we'll have to wait to see quite what that balance is. But clearly, from President Trump's point of view, he wants to get the Europeans to pay for as much of it as possible.
And do you know, I mean, are we aware, is it in the public domain, just how many of these Patriot missile defense systems have actually been delivered to Ukraine, and what's arrived and what's on the way?
Well, I don't think that is in the public domain, Tom, and I wouldn't want to sort of speculate that on that in public, to be honest, because these are really important systems, and it's important that Russia is not sort of given a heads up on exactly what is being delivered when and where.
Fair enough. And I mean, we heard President Trump along the campaign trail saying, you got to pay. If they're not going to pay, we're not going to protect. OK. So, I mean, people in Europe and elsewhere in the world, you know, can't really be that surprised, can they, that this administration has a rather different approach to how it arms its allies and what level of involvement it wants in this war in Ukraine?
Yes, I think we've seen some toing and froing on this issue over the last 6 months. There are certain members of President Trump's administration, and possibly President Trump himself, who would like to pay much less in terms of support for European allies, support for Ukraine. But there are other pressures going in the other direction, including in Congress from the Republican Party. So I think it's still all to sort of play for in the longer term. What is important in the shorter term is that the sort of earlier threats to cut off intelligence sharing, which is really important, and to cut off the supply of weaponry has gone away. And President Trump seems to be much more convinced that he needs to support either directly or indirectly Ukraine, and that President Putin is not to be trusted.
And just lastly, Samar, I just want to ask you very briefly. I mean, we heard President Trump saying at the end of 50 days, if we don't have a deal, it's going to be too bad. I mean, do you think we might have in 49 days from now, because the clock is ticking, a major escalation in this war?
Well, the obvious escalation, and the one that he's sort of hinted at, is so-called secondary tariffs. And that means, for instance, that if India is buying Russian oil and gas, then 100% tariffs would be imposed on Indian exports to the United States. Now, that would be absolutely devastating, because it would mean that India would immediately stop buying Russian oil and gas. The same, arguably, for China and other countries as well. So if he was to follow through on that threat, it is a very real threat that could decimate the Russian economy. So I think it will be an important moment at that point. But of course, there are some commentators who are saying, using that phrase taco, that Trump always chickens out. And I think people will be watching to see whether he's prepared in this particular instance to follow through on that threat that he's made if there is no progress towards a deal in 50 days. What he hopes is that that threat is sufficiently credible that it will make Putin come to the table again and start talking about a future of a peace process.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Samar Grant, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, turning now to Gaza, where the humanitarian crisis appears to be deepening even further. At least 21 people reported to have been killed at a food distribution site of the US and Israeli-backed GHF in southern Gaza. That's according to local health ministry sources. Well, for more on the humanitarian situation, we can cross now to Amman and speak to Jonathan Fowler, who's a spokesperson for UNRWA. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Jonathan. We're being told about this deadly situation at a GHF aid distribution site in Khan Yunis in the south of Gaza. We're told most of the people who were killed were trampled on. One was stabbed. I mean, what do we know about what happened there?
I mean, it's, information is still emerging, but this is just the latest in a series of tragic occurrences at these distribution sites. I mean, it just shows that the concept is fundamentally flawed from this so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. I mean, it's like violence is baked into the way that these things operate. I mean, we just haven't had this kind of situation when the UN has been allowed to operate and do its job of work on the ground. Question has to be why. But this just keeps happening and happening, and the numbers just keep racking up. More than 800 people killed at these sites. I mean, people are. Is it even a choice, sort of eat or die, basically? I mean, that's the sort of situation that people are being placed in this absolutely desperate humanitarian situation.
And yet the GHF is saying that Hamas was behind the unrest. It stirred up all the trouble. Does that sound like a likely explanation to you?
I mean, it's impossible for me to respond to a question like that, unfortunately. But I mean, the fact that we see these occurrences over and over suggests that there's something badly flawed about the operational model of the GHF. I mean, I've been on this show before, and I think I previously reminded your viewers that the original CEO of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation actually quit on the eve of its beginning to operations in May, and he said he was quitting because he was not in a position to guarantee principles of international humanitarian law, including, neutrality, impartiality, independence, and humanity. Now, over and over and over, we've seen these problems with this model, and so, to sort of refer people back to his words. And this was somebody who was intimately involved in setting up this operational model. The question is, why does this keep happening? I mean, there is a problem here.
Yeah, I mean, we're told by the UN Human Rights Office in Geneva that at least 875 deaths have been recorded during the last 6 weeks, most of them either at or near GHF distribution points. I mean, do you ever see these types of tragedy and killings in other parts of the world at aid distribution sites? I mean, is it something that happens regularly when clearly desperate people line up to get food? Is it something you've seen elsewhere?
Absolutely not. I mean, there is no precedent for this kind of situation. I mean, one of the fundamental problems is also, I've talked about it's the securitization, the militarization of the operational model, but it's also the fact that they have only a handful of distribution sites, whereas the United Nations-led aid operation, when that was permitted to work by the Israeli authorities, notably between January and March, beginning of March, of course, they imposed a total siege on humanitarian aid. But when that was permitted to operate, we were able to fan out as much as possible across the Gaza Strip, hundreds of distribution points, go to where the people in need were. So, I mean, another problem with this model is that people have to kind of go through dangerous areas, strewn with rubble, unexploded ordnance, even fighting to get to these few distribution points. So that's a fundamental issue too. I mean, these are death traps basically, and none of this is being done in a way that serves the people that it's supposedly intending to serve.
Yeah, I mean, we've got desperate conditions, famine-like conditions, people desperate to get their hands on food for themselves and for their families. I mean, under international law, who bears responsibility for ensuring that civilians are able to access food, water, and other essentials?
I mean, there are obligations incumbent upon warring parties in any war under international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and so on. The well-being of a population is supposed to be ensured by all involved, and that includes allowing the international community in the shape of the United Nations, international humanitarians, to do their job of work. So to permit that. Now, when it comes to responsibility and accountability, that's a much wider issue. The stranglehold on aid is one aspect of that issue of responsibility and not living up to that. It's certainly up to the state of Israel to facilitate humanitarian aid, but to do it in a way which is grounded in international humanitarian law, and that is what's not happening currently.
I mean, it looks like the GHF is mismanaged. I mean, are there any obvious quick fixes that, with your expertise, you could offer them to ensure that at least, if they can't have a perfect aid distribution system, at least it will be markedly better than it is now?
The quick fix is to go back to the situation during the ceasefire. And indeed, the situation, although it wasn't allowed to function properly in the non-ceasefire periods, but where aid was allowed to flow in under the auspices of the United Nations. That's the fix. We have thousands of trucks waiting outside of Gaza, which could come in tomorrow if they were allowed to. So, I mean, fixing something which is fundamentally flawed, that there is no reason for that to happen. There's been this total focus, this prioritization on this GHF. That is not the way to do it. We warned before it started that was not the way to do it. And now it's happening. We're warning over and over, and yet there's this sort of, this over focus, this obsession on somehow, redeveloping their model to make it work better. Well, no, that's not what should be happening. What should be happening is to go back to a UN aid operation. I mean, that's what we do around the world, whether it's in war zones or if it's in natural disaster areas, and that works effectively.
And were the GHF to invite, UNRWA and other UN agencies to work alongside them, what would be your response?
The way they work is not compatible with international humanitarian law. It's in nobody's interest that the United Nations starts to get involved in an operation like this. As I've emphasized, and I'll emphasize again, we have the capacity to do a proper aid operation, which is grounded in international humanitarian law, the impartiality, the neutrality. I mean, as it stands, this is an aid operation which is co-run by one party to the conflict. That's a problem in itself, as well as the whole militarization of this kind of aid operation. I mean, look, in disaster areas around the world, you've sometimes seen militaries getting involved in aid operations, but not, at the expense of the United Nations system, sometimes in parallel, and not when they're parties to a conflict. I mean, that's just something that doesn't happen. There's no reason why it should be any different in the Gaza Strip.
And for the benefit of our viewers, really, who may have forgotten, because there are a lot of developments in Gaza and things happen on a sort of hourly basis. Just remind us what reasons UNRWA was given at the outset for not being allowed to carry out its duties as it did before.
We have been given no reasons on the grounds that the Israeli parliament at the end of October last year voted legislation to ban all cooperation with UNRWA. So this is unilateral ban. There's nothing stopping us getting in touch with them, but they can't be in touch with us. Now, that means that law came into force at the end of January this year, and that has basically sort of guillotined any possibility of cooperation between the Israeli authorities and the largest UN humanitarian agency on the ground in Gaza. Thousands of operational staff trying to do their job of work and being severely constrained by this. No reasons given to us by the Israeli authorities. Look, we all read the media, we all listen to the claims, the assertions, the spurious arguments that have been proffered by the Israeli authorities for this ban on contact and working with us, but that doesn't make it in any way acceptable. And this is literally about unpicking and destroying the United Nations-led humanitarian operation, but not then creating something to replace it. No, I'm not saying it should be replaced. What I'm saying is, if there's an aspiration to replace it, they've not even done that in a way which is in any way, properly done. And then we hear all kinds of other things about, supposedly concentrating the population in particular areas, repeated rounds of forced displacement. This is just wrong on so many levels.
Before we talk about the overall situation more broadly, because I want to ask you for sort of an update really on what's happening on the ground, what the humanitarian situation is, just to sort of wrap up this section on the GHF and these claims and counterclaims. The Palestinians say that Israeli troops open fire almost every day on crowds and roads where people are heading to these distribution points for aid. Have you seen any proof that it is indeed Israeli troops that are firing on desperate people, or is it very vague, even from the images that you've seen, as to who's firing on who?
We're not an investigative body and we're not there on the ground, but we get information that comes up from the ground, and that's included in previous incidents, details that have come up from international doctors who've been able to operate in the area, and it seems there is some kind of pattern. Like I said, I'm not able to confirm anything ourselves. But we've also seen in the Israeli media, reports from Israeli soldiers saying they received orders to do certain things. The point is that this is an utter militarization of humanitarian aid. It seems to go sort of beyond crowd control into something much more serious, and that in itself is a problem. It's possible to identify a pattern. This is the thing.
Okay, let's talk about the situation on the ground faced by the 2 million people who live in Gaza. Obviously, a catastrophic humanitarian situation. For several weeks, we've been hearing from people on the ground, people saying that the entire enclave is teetering on the brink of famine. Is that still the case, or would you say it's plateaued, or are things getting worse? What's the latest?
The situation is getting worse, partly because, as I said, the number of distribution sites and the quantity of aid that is being brought in, all of that is completely insufficient. Now, let's not forget, this is a man-made hunger crisis. This is not a natural disaster, like a famine caused by a drought. This is a human policy choice that has been made to keep aid at a very restricted level, which is completely insufficient to feed a people under siege. Now, this is, we see this, for example, absolutely horrific. We see the level of child malnutrition, about 1 in 10 of the children being screened in our clinics, which are still able to function currently, You know, these are children with malnutrition. Now, you know, this means an immediate risk of death, but it also has longer term potential impacts for youngsters. You know, the cognitive impacts, the physical developmental impacts, all of these kind of things. So, you know, this is something which is trickling on into the decades to come if these children survive. So, I mean, that's what we see. You know, people are just not. They do not have enough to eat, and this is because not enough is being brought in. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.